The silence that fell over the graveyard in Manassas, Colorado, spoke volumes as Virginia Taylor stared at her husband's coffin with dry eyes. Not a single tear marked her pale cheeks, even as Reverend Palmer's words about the dearly departed echoed across the windswept cemetery. Virginia's face betrayed nothing but the faintest hint of relief, a subtle loosening around her mouth, a straightening of her shoulders beneath her black mourning dress, as though a great weight had finally been lifted. Samuel Nash noticed. The tall cowboy stood at the back of the gathering, hat clutched respectfully in his weathered hands. He hadn't known Harold Taylor, well, few in town truly had, but he'd seen the bruises Virginia tried to hide beneath high collars and long sleeves. He'd heard the shouting from their small house at the edge of town late at night. And now, watching the 25-year-old widow's face as they lowered her husband into the unforgiving Colorado earth in the summer of 1876, Samuel understood more than most what this death truly meant. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," the Reverend intoned, his words carried away by the warm June breeze that rustled through the cottonwoods surrounding the cemetery. Virginia placed a single white rose atop the wooden coffin, her slender fingers steady and sure. Harold Taylor, dead at 37 from a sudden fever that had taken him in just 3 days. Some called it a tragedy. Virginia couldn't bring herself to think of it as anything but deliverance. The small crowd of townspeople began to disperse as the gravediggers moved in to complete their work. Several women approached Virginia, offering condolences and invitations for supper. She accepted them with practiced grace, her voice soft but controlled. Not once did her composure break. Samuel remained, watching from a distance as the widow acknowledged each sympathetic touch with a nod, each murmured platitude with a quiet "thank you." When the last of the mourners departed, Virginia stood alone by the partially filled grave, her black veil lifting slightly in the breeze. That was when Samuel approached, his spurs jingling softly in the cemetery's silence. "Mrs. Taylor," he said, his voice low and respectful. Virginia turned, startled by the tall figure suddenly beside her. "Mr. Nash," she acknowledged, recognizing the ranch hand who occasionally came into the general store where she worked. His presence was unexpected. Harold had few friends, and Samuel Nash certainly hadn't been among them. "I wanted to offer my condolences," he said simply, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Condolences were for those in grief, and grief was notably absent from Virginia's clear blue eyes. "Thank you," she replied automatically. "It was kind of you to attend." Samuel shifted his weight, weathered boots disturbing the dry soil beneath them. At 30, his face already showed lines from years under the harsh Colorado sun, but his eyes remained kind. "Mrs. Taylor, Virginia, I know this may seem forward," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But I wanted to say that if you need any help in the coming days, I'd be honored to assist." Virginia studied him, her gaze unexpectedly direct. "Help with what precisely, Mr. Nash?" "Whatever you might need. Repairs around your house, perhaps. I understand your husband left some things unfinished." A flash of something recognition perhaps crossed her face. She understood his meaning, though neither would speak it aloud. Harold's reputation wasn't unknown in Manassas, though most turned a blind eye to how he treated his wife. "That's very generous," she said finally. "But I wouldn't want to impose." Samuel looked down at his hat, turning the brim in his hands. "It wouldn't be an imposition, madam. I have my own place now, small cabin on some land outside town. Been working it when I'm not at the Peterson Ranch. I could help you make a fresh start if you wanted." Virginia's eyes widened slightly at the implication of his words. "Mr. Nash, I've only just buried my husband." "I know, and I don't mean to speak ill of the dead or disrespect his memory," Samuel said, though they both knew Harold Taylor's memory deserved little respect. "But I've seen you at church, at the store. I've seen how you—" He paused, uncertain how to continue without overstepping. "How I what, Mr. Nash?" Her voice had taken on an edge. "How you've endured," he finished quietly. "And I thought perhaps you might be ready to do more than just endure." Virginia's carefully maintained composure faltered for the first time that day. Her lips parted slightly and she drew a sharp breath. No one had ever acknowledged her suffering so directly, nor offered her a path beyond it. "I should go," she said after a moment, gathering her skirts. "People will talk if we linger here." Samuel nodded, stepping back. "Of course." "Forgive my presumption." Virginia turned to leave, then paused. Without looking back, she said, "My roof leaks near the kitchen chimney. If you're serious about those repairs, perhaps you could look at it tomorrow afternoon." "I'll be there at 2, Samuel replied, careful to keep the hope from his voice. Virginia gave a single nod before walking away, her black dress stark against the green grass and wildflowers that dotted the cemetery. Samuel watched her go, understanding that she had just taken her first step toward a different life. As Virginia walked the dusty road back to her small house at the edge of Manasseh, she felt an unfamiliar lightness in her chest. For the first time in 7 years, she would sleep without fear of Harold's drunken rage. For the first time in 7 years, she would wake without the dread of what the day might bring. And for the first time since she could remember, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and offered not pity, but possibility. The small frame house appeared ahead, looking particularly forlorn in the late afternoon light. Virginia paused at the gate, steeling herself to enter the home that had been her prison for so long. Now, without Harold's suffocating presence, perhaps it could simply be a house, one with a leaking roof that a kind cowboy had offered to fix. The thought brought the first genuine smile to her face that Virginia had felt in years. The following afternoon, Virginia found herself nervously tidying her already immaculate home. She'd spent the morning scrubbing away Harold's presents, boxing his clothes for the church charity, removing his shaving kit from the washstand, taking down the hunting rifle he'd sometimes threatened her with from above the fireplace. Each item removed felt like another chain breaking. When a knock sounded at precisely 2 o'clock, Virginia smoothed her gray dress, not black. She'd deliberately chosen not to wear mourning in private, and opened the door to find Samuel Nash standing on her porch, hat in hand. "Mrs. Taylor," he greeted her, his voice warm. "Mr. Nash." "Please come in." Virginia stepped aside, allowing him to enter. She noticed he'd made an effort with his appearance. His shirt was clean, his dark hair damp from a recent washing. Samuel ducked slightly to enter the low doorway, his tall frame making the small front room seem even smaller. He looked around, taking in the simple furnishings, the immaculate floor, the single photograph of Virginia as a young woman before her marriage. There were no pictures of Harold visible. "I appreciate you coming," Virginia said, closing the door. "The leak is in the kitchen." Samuel followed her through the front room into the small kitchen at the back of the house. Virginia pointed to a water stain on the ceiling near where the chimney pipe went through the roof. "It gets worse when it rains," she explained. "Harold always said he'd fix it, but—" She trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. "I'll have a look from outside," Samuel said. "Do you have a ladder in the shed out back?" As Samuel went to retrieve the ladder, Virginia busied herself making coffee. This ordinary domestic task, entertaining a visitor, preparing refreshments, felt strange after years of isolation. Harold had discouraged visitors, preferring to keep Virginia to himself. From the kitchen window, she watched as Samuel positioned the ladder against the side of the house, and climbed nimbly to the roof. There was something reassuring about his confident movements, the careful way he tested each rung before trusting his weight to it. So different from Harold's impulsive, often destructive actions. 20 minutes later, Samuel knocked again at the back door. Virginia opened it to find him holding his hat, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. "I found the problem," he said. "The flashing around the chimney has pulled away. I can fix it today if you have some tools and maybe a bit of tin." "There are tools in the shed," Virginia replied. "I'm not sure about tin, though." "I brought some, just in case," Samuel said, gesturing to his saddlebag resting near the base of the ladder. "Thought it might be something like that. Most roof leaks are." Virginia nodded, feeling awkward suddenly. "I've made coffee if you'd like some before you start." Samuel's expression softened. "That would be nice, thank you." They sat at Virginia's small kitchen table, an unfamiliar tableau. Virginia couldn't remember the last time she'd shared coffee with anyone in her own home. Harold had taken his meals irregularly, often eating standing up before heading back out to the saloon. "How long have you been in Manassas?" Virginia asked, breaking the silence. "About 3 years," Samuel replied. "Came west from Missouri after the war. Worked my way through Kansas, then up to Colorado. Hired on at the Peterson place as a hand, saved enough to buy my own parcel last year." "You fought in the war?" Virginia asked, curious despite herself. Samuel nodded, his expression clouding slightly. "Union cavalry. Enlisted in '63 when I was 18. Saw more than I cared to, like most who served." Virginia nodded, understanding his reticence. Many men who'd returned from the war preferred not to speak of it. "And now you're a rancher." "Trying to be," Samuel said, a small smile returning to his face. "Got 40 acres, a dozen cattle, and big dreams." His eyes, a warm hazel color Virginia hadn't properly noticed before, met hers. "What about you? Have you always lived in Manassas?" Virginia shook her head. "No, I grew up in Denver. My father was a banker there. I met Harold when he came through on business. He courted me quite differently then." She stopped, realizing she'd said more than she intended. "Then how he was after you married," Samuel finished quietly. Virginia looked down at her coffee cup, embarrassed by her transparency. "Yes, it happens that way sometimes," Samuel said, no judgment in his tone. "People show one face during courtship and another after the vows are spoken. Is that why you've never married Mr. Nash?" Virginia asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Samuel's laugh was soft and genuine. "Partly, perhaps. Mostly I've been too busy working and saving. Wanted to have something to offer before I considered taking a wife." He paused, then added, "And please call me Samuel, or Sam if you prefer." "Sam," Virginia tried the name, finding she liked its simplicity. "And I'm Virginia, though most people call me Ginny." "Ginny," he repeated, and the way he said it made her name sound somehow new. "It suits you." A moment of silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable but charged with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Samuel placed his empty cup on the table and stood. "I should see to that roof before the afternoon gets away from us." Virginia nodded, gathering the cups. "Of course. Let me know if you need anything." As Samuel worked on the roof, Virginia found herself moving about her tasks with unusual energy. She swept the front porch, organized the pantry shelves, and even began sorting through a trunk of fabric scraps she'd been saving for a quilt. The house felt different with Samuel's steady footsteps overhead, not invaded, as it had felt with Harold, but protected. When Samuel finally came down from the roof, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. His shirt was damp with sweat, his hands smudged with tar, but his expression was satisfied. "That should hold it," he told Virginia as she handed him a dipper of cool water from the bucket. I sealed around the chimney and replaced some damaged shingles. You shouldn't have any more trouble, even in the heaviest rain. Virginia felt a disproportionate gratitude for this simple repair. Thank you. What do I owe you for your time? Samuel shook his head, returning the dipper. Nothing. I was happy to help. Please, I insist on paying something. For the materials, at least. Samuel regarded her thoughtfully, then said, If you really want to repay me, perhaps you might accept an invitation to supper on Sunday after church, at the hotel restaurant. Virginia blinked in surprise. You're asking me to dine with you, publicly? Yes, Samuel said simply. If that wouldn't make you uncomfortable. Virginia considered the implications. A widow dining with a single man so soon after her husband's death would certainly cause talk in a small town like Manassas. Yet the prospect held an undeniable appeal. People will gossip, she said, voicing her concern. People always find reasons to gossip, Samuel replied with a slight shrug. But if you'd rather wait until more time has passed, I understand. Virginia thought of the years she'd spent confined by Harold's jealousy and control, the way she'd shaped her every action to avoid his displeasure. The freedom to make her own choices, even controversial ones, was still new and intoxicating. No, she said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. I'd like to have supper with you on Sunday. Thank you for the invitation. Samuel's smile transformed his weather-beaten face, revealing a dimple in his right cheek that Virginia had never noticed before. I'll call for you after the service, then. As he gathered his tools and prepared to leave, Virginia felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to identify it as happiness. The next few days passed in a blur of small revelations for Virginia. She discovered the pleasure of choosing what to eat for supper without considering Harold's preferences. She found herself humming as she worked at the general store, earning curious glances from Mrs. Benson, the owner's wife. She even unpacked her small collection of novels Harold had dismissed as frivolous and placed them prominently on the shelf in the front room. By Sunday morning, Virginia stood before her wardrobe, contemplating her limited selection of dresses. The black morning dress hung at one end, proper and expected. Next to it hung her gray day dress, serviceable but plain. At the far end, pushed to the back, was a dress she hadn't worn in years, a blue cotton with small white flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs. Harold had called it too showy the one time she'd worn it after their marriage. Virginia's hand hovered between the black and the blue, duty warring with desire. Finally, she reached for the blue dress, her heart beating a little faster as she laid it on the bed. She would not pretend to mourn a man who had caused her nothing but pain. In church, she felt the weight of curious stares as she sat in her usual pew, the blue of her dress standing out amid the Sunday blacks and browns. Reverend Palmer made no mention of her attire during his sermon on forgiveness and new beginnings, but his eyes lingered on her with something like approval. Samuel sat several rows back, and Virginia resisted the urge to turn and look at him. Only when the service ended and the congregation began to file out did she allow herself to meet his gaze. The admiration in his eyes made her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Taylor," he greeted her on the church steps, tipping his hat. "You look lovely today." "Thank you, Mr. Nash," she replied, aware of the curious glances from those passing by. "Are you still interested in sharing that meal?" "Very much so," he affirmed, offering his arm. "Shall we?" Virginia hesitated only a moment before placing her hand lightly on his sleeve. The simple touch, this public declaration of connection, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Manassas, which wasn't saying much. Still, with its white tablecloths and glass oil lamps, It represented luxury in the small frontier town. As Samuel led Virginia to a table near the window, she felt the eyes of other diners following them. "Perhaps this wasn't the best idea," she murmured as they sat down. "Everyone is staring." "Let them," Samuel said calmly, unfolding his napkin. "We're doing nothing wrong." The waitress, a young girl named Emma whom Virginia knew from church, approached with poorly concealed curiosity. "What can I get for you today?" she asked, her eyes darting between them. Samuel ordered the roast beef for both of them with coffee. When Emma departed, Virginia leaned forward slightly. "People will talk about this for weeks," she said. "Does that bother you?" Samuel asked, his expression serious. Virginia considered the question honestly. "It should," she admitted. A respectable widow wouldn't be dining out so soon after her husband's passing. But she paused, searching for the right words. "But," Samuel prompted gently. "But I find I don't care as much as I thought I would," Virginia finished. "I spent 7 years caring intensely about what others thought, or rather, what Harold thought. It's liberating not to carry that burden anymore." Samuel's face softened. "You deserve that liberation, Ginny, and more." Their meal arrived, temporarily halting their conversation. Virginia found herself enjoying not just the food, which was indeed better than her own cooking, but the entire experience of dining in public with a man who looked at her with respect rather than possession. As they ate, Samuel told her about his plans for his small ranch, the cattle he hoped to breed, the garden he'd started, the fruit trees he'd planted that wouldn't bear for years yet. "You're planning for a long future there," Virginia observed. "I am," Samuel acknowledged. "I spent too many years drifting after the war. When I found this place, something told me to put down roots." He paused, then added more quietly, "A man shouldn't live his whole life alone." Virginia felt a flutter in her chest at his words and the way his eyes held hers. "No," she agreed softly. "Nor should a woman." They finished their meal in a comfortable silence, each aware of the subtle shift in their relationship. When they stepped out of the restaurant into the warm June afternoon, Samuel surprised Virginia by suggesting a walk. "It's a beautiful day," he said. "Would you like to see a bit more of the town with me before I take you home?" Virginia hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that." They strolled along Manassas Main Street, past the general store where Virginia worked, the blacksmith shop with its familiar ring of hammer on anvil, and the small schoolhouse closed for Sunday. Children played in yards, women gathered on porches, and men stood in small groups, smoking and talking. All seemed to notice the widow in blue walking alongside the tall cowboy. "You miss Denver?" Samuel asked as they turned down a quieter side street lined with cottonwoods. "Sometimes," Virginia admitted. "I miss the theaters, the variety of shops. Mostly, I miss the anonymity, being able to walk down a street without everyone knowing my business." "We could visit someday," Samuel suggested, then immediately looked as though he regretted his presumption. "That is, I mean," Virginia surprised herself by laughing, a genuine, unguarded sound she almost didn't recognize as her own. "Samuel Nash, are you already planning outings for us beyond today?" Samuel's cheeks reddened slightly, but he met her gaze steadily. "I suppose I am. Too forward of me." "Perhaps," Virginia acknowledged, "but I find I don't mind it." They had reached the edge of town, where the neat row of houses gave way to open meadows dotted with wildflowers. Virginia paused, reluctant to continue their walk into such a secluded area. Despite her growing comfort with Samuel, propriety still had its limits. "We should head back," she said. Samuel nodded, understanding without explanation. As they turned back toward town, he said, "Ginny, I want to be honest with you." Virginia felt a flutter of apprehension at his serious tone. "Yes, I'm interested in courting you properly," he said simply. Not just helping with repairs or sharing Sunday meals, though I'd like those too, but I understand if it's too soon or if you're not interested in considering marriage again after. After Harold, Virginia finished for him. Samuel nodded, watching her face carefully. Virginia took a deep breath, considering his words. The idea of marriage had been so inextricably linked with pain and fear in her mind that her first instinct was to refuse outright. Yet there was something about Samuel, his steady presence, his thoughtfulness, the way he looked at her as a person rather than a possession, that made her pause. "I can't give you an answer today," she said finally. "Marriage is. It's not something I've thought of as a possibility for a long time." "I understand," Samuel said, no disappointment evident in his tone. "I don't expect an answer now. I just wanted you to know my intentions are honorable." Virginia nodded, touched by his straightforwardness. "Thank you for your honesty and for a lovely afternoon." By the time they reached Virginia's house, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in shades of pink and gold. Samuel walked her to her door, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you for joining me today," he said, hat in hand. "Would it be all right if I called on you again?" "Perhaps next Sunday." Virginia found herself smiling. "I'd like that." As she watched him walk back toward town, Virginia felt something unfamiliar stirring in her heart, not just gratitude or relief, but a tentative, fragile hope that perhaps the future held more for her than mere survival. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. Samuel would call on Virginia after church each Sunday, sometimes taking her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, sometimes bringing a picnic basket to enjoy on her front porch. Occasionally, he would arrive midweek with fresh vegetables from his garden or offer to help with a household task. July turned to August, and the summer heat settled over Manasseh like a wool blanket. Virginia found herself looking forward to Samuel's visits with increasing anticipation, planning what she would wear and what they might talk about. Their conversations had grown deeper, more personal. She told him about her childhood in Denver, about her father's death that had left her vulnerable to Harold's courtship, about the dreams she'd abandoned when she married. Samuel, in turn, shared stories of his family back in Missouri, parents long dead, a sister married and living in Kansas, a brother lost at Gettysburg. He spoke of his wartime experiences sparingly, but didn't shy away from Virginia's questions. Each revelation brought them closer, building a foundation of understanding and trust. The town's initial gossip about them had gradually subsided into acceptance. Virginia noticed Mrs. Benson watching with knowing eyes whenever Samuel stopped by the general store, but the older woman's expression held approval rather than censure. Even Reverend Palmer had taken to greeting them as a pair after services. On a particularly hot August afternoon, Virginia was sorting inventory at the store when the bell over the door jingled. She looked up to see Samuel entering, his hat in his hands. "Good afternoon," she greeted him, unable to suppress her smile. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Samuel returned her smile, though Virginia noticed a tension around his eyes. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "Not at all. Mrs. Benson is visiting her sister in Denver this week, so I'm managing things on my own. What brings you to town on a Wednesday?" Samuel glanced around the empty store before answering. "I've had an offer on some cattle, a good price that would help me expand the herd faster than I'd planned, but I need to deliver them to Denver by next week." Virginia felt her smile fade slightly. "You're leaving?" "Just for a week, maybe 10 days, Samuel assured her. "But I wanted to tell you in person, not leave you wondering why I didn't come on Sunday." The fact that he'd considered her feelings touched Virginia deeply. "When do you go?" "Tomorrow morning early," Samuel replied. "It's a 4-day drive to Denver if the weather holds." Virginia nodded, absently straightening a display of canned goods. "Well, I hope the journey is successful for you." Samuel stepped closer, lowering his voice though they were alone in the store. "Ginny, I was hoping. That is, I wondered if you might join me for supper tonight, at my place." Virginia's hand stilled on the cans. "At your ranch?" "Yes," Samuel confirmed, a touch of nervousness in his voice. "I know it's not entirely proper, but I thought since I'll be gone for a while I'd like to show you my home before I leave." Virginia considered the invitation. A proper widow would refuse, of course. Visiting an unmarried man's home alone would set tongues wagging again, just as the gossip had begun to die down. Yet the prospect of seeing Samuel's ranch, of understanding the place that meant so much to him, was undeniably appealing. "I'd need to close the store early," she said, making her decision. Samuel's face brightened. "I can help you close up, then drive you out in my wagon. I'd have you back well before dark, I promise." An hour later, having locked the store and left a note explaining the early closure, Virginia found herself seated beside Samuel in his wagon as they headed out of town. The August sun beat down relentlessly, but a canvas awning over the wagon seat provided welcome shade. "It's not far," Samuel explained as they followed a narrow road that wound through grassy foothills. "About 3 miles from town, far enough for privacy, close enough for convenience." Virginia nodded, watching the landscape roll by. After the confines of town and her small house, the open country felt liberating. Wildflowers dotted the grasses in splashes of yellow and purple, and the distant mountains stood blue-hazed against the horizon. "It's beautiful out here," she said, breathing deeply of the sage-scented air. Samuel glanced at her, pleasure evident in his expression. "I thought so too the first time I saw it. Something about this valley just felt right." After about 20 minutes, the wagon crested a small rise and Samuel's ranch came into view below. Virginia leaned forward, taking in the sight. A small log cabin stood in a natural clearing, smoke rising lazily from its stone chimney. Behind it, a sturdy barn and corral housed several horses and what looked to be about 15 head of cattle. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows. Near the cabin, Virginia could make out neat rows of a vegetable garden and several young fruit trees supported by stakes. "Samuel," she breathed. "It's lovely." The pride on his face was unmistakable as he guided the wagon down the slope toward the cabin. "It's not much yet, but I'm adding to it bit by bit." As they drew closer, Virginia noticed the details: the carefully split rail fences, the covered well with its windlass, the porch Samuel had built along the front of the cabin with 2 rocking chairs placed side by side. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work. Samuel helped Virginia down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment, they stood close enough that Virginia could smell the soap he'd used that morning and see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. Then he stepped back, gesturing toward the cabin. "Would you like to see inside?" Virginia nodded, suddenly aware of how intimate this invitation truly was. She followed Samuel up the 2 steps to the porch, noticing how the boards had been planed smooth, free of splinters that might catch a lady's skirts. The cabin's interior surprised her with its spaciousness and order. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A solid table with 4 chairs stood in the center, while a comfortable-looking armchair was positioned near the fire. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, dishes, and a few personal items. "You have quite a library," Virginia observed, noting the number of volumes. Samuel smiled, running his hand along the spines of several books. "Reading helps pass the winter evenings." "Do you like to read?" "Very much," Virginia replied. though Harold considered it a waste of time. Samuel's expression darkened briefly at the mention of her late husband. I've never understood men who discourage learning in their wives. A sharp mind is a blessing in any partnership. Virginia felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. She continued her tour of the cabin, noting the craftsmanship of the furniture, some purchased, some clearly made by Samuel's own hands. A doorway at the back led to a single bedroom, its door currently standing open to allow air circulation. Virginia hesitated at the threshold, aware of the impropriety of examining a single man's sleeping quarters. Samuel noticed her pause and quickly moved to close the door. "Sorry," he said. "Should have thought of that before bringing you in." "It's all right," Virginia assured him, touched by his consideration. "Your home is wonderful, Samuel. You've created something special here." His smile returned, warming his features. "Thank you. It's meant to be more than just a place for me, though. I always envisioned a family here." His eyes met hers briefly before he turned toward the kitchen area. "Are you hungry? I promised you supper." To Virginia's surprise, Samuel proved to be a competent cook. He prepared a simple but delicious meal of pan-fried trout caught from the creek that morning, served with potatoes and green beans from his garden. They ate at the table, sunlight slanting through the western windows as evening approached. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Virginia asked, impressed. "Army taught me the basics," Samuel replied. "Necessity improved my skills after that. A man living alone either learns to cook or eats poorly." Virginia laughed. "You're better than I am with that trout." "My father never approved of women fishing, so I never learned to prepare it properly." "I could teach you sometime," Samuel offered. "The creek has plenty of fish." The casual suggestion, so domestic, so indicative of a shared future, hung between them. Virginia took a sip of water, considering how to respond. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice soft. After supper, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they sat on the porch in the rocking chairs. The evening air had cooled slightly, bringing relief from the day's heat. Crickets began their nightly chorus in the surrounding meadow, and swallows darted above the creek, catching insects on the wing. "I can see why you love it here," Virginia said, letting her chair rock gently. "It's so peaceful." Samuel nodded, his profile gilded by the setting sun. "The first night I slept here in a tent. Before the cabin was built, I felt at home in a way I hadn't since before the war. Like I'd been wandering for years, and finally found where I belonged." Virginia understood that feeling. Despite living in her house in Manassas for 7 years, she'd never felt it was truly home. It had always been Harold's house, Harold's domain. Here, on Samuel's porch, she felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her for a long time. "I should get you back to town before it gets too dark," Samuel said reluctantly. Noting the lengthening shadows, Virginia nodded, equally reluctant to end the evening. They rode back to Manassas in a comfortable silence, the cooling air bringing out the scents of sage and pine from the surrounding hills. By the time they reached Virginia's house, dusk was settling over the town. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, then walked her to her door. "Thank you for coming today," he said. "It meant a lot to show you the place." Virginia looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it very much." In the gathering darkness, Samuel's expression was difficult to read. He seemed to be debating something internally. Finally, he said, "Ginny, before I leave tomorrow, may I write to you while I'm in Denver?" "I'd like that," Virginia replied, her heart beating a little faster. "And may I call on you when I return?" "Yes." Samuel hesitated, then slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he reached for her hand. His touch was gentle as he raised her fingers to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. The gesture, so formal yet intimate, sent a shiver through Virginia. "Good night, Ginny," he said, releasing her hand. "I'll see you when I get back." "Safe travels, Samuel," she replied, her voice slightly unsteady. As Samuel drove away, Virginia stood on her porch, her hand still tingling from his kiss. In that moment, she acknowledged to herself what she had been increasingly unable to deny: she was falling in love with Samuel Nash. The realization should have frightened her, given her experience with marriage. Instead, it filled her with a cautious joy. Samuel was nothing like Harold. Where Harold had been volatile and demanding, Samuel was steady and considerate. Where Harold had sought to control and diminish her, Samuel seemed to value her thoughts and independence. Still, as Virginia prepared for bed that night, doubts crept in. Was she rushing into another situation that might turn sour once promises were made? Could she trust her judgment about Samuel when she had been so wrong about Harold? The questions followed her into sleep, where her dreams mingled memories of Harold's rages with images of Samuel's gentle smile. The next 10 days passed with agonizing slowness for Virginia. She threw herself into her work at the store, took extra care with her small garden at home, and even began cutting pieces for the quilt she'd been planning for months. Each activity helped fill the hours but couldn't fully distract her from thoughts of Samuel. On the 4th day after his departure, a letter arrived delivered by the stagecoach driver who made the Denver run twice weekly. Virginia recognized Samuel's handwriting immediately, and her heart leaped at the sight of it. She waited until evening, when she was alone in her house, to read it. The letter was simple but heartfelt. Samuel described his journey to Denver, the successful sale of his cattle, and the city itself, which had grown significantly since Virginia had last seen it. He mentioned visiting a bookshop and wondering what titles she might enjoy, and closed with a hope to see her soon. Virginia read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in her bureau drawer. That night, she sat at her small writing desk and composed a reply, telling Samuel about happenings in Manassas, describing a particularly beautiful sunset she'd witnessed, and admitting, after much deliberation, that she missed their Sunday conversations. When Sunday came, Virginia felt his absence keenly. She attended church alone, declining Mrs. Benson's invitation to Sunday dinner afterward. Instead, she returned home and reread Samuel's letter, wondering where he was and when he might return. The answer came the following Thursday. Virginia was sweeping the store's front porch when she heard the familiar sound of wagon wheels. Looking up, she saw Samuel driving into town, his wagon loaded with supplies. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and the smile that spread across his face mirrored the warmth blooming in her chest. Samuel guided the wagon to the front of the store, setting the brake before jumping down. "Ginny," he greeted her, removing his hat. "It's good to see you." Virginia was suddenly aware of Mrs. Benson watching from inside the store and several townspeople passing by on the street. Despite their audience, she couldn't suppress her smile. "Welcome back, Samuel. How was Denver?" "Busy, loud, not nearly as pleasant as Manassas," he replied, his eyes not leaving her face. "Especially today." The compliment brought color to Virginia's cheeks. "Did you get everything you needed there?" Samuel nodded, gesturing to his loaded wagon. "Supplies for the winter, some new equipment for the ranch, and a few other things." He glanced toward the store entrance, where Mrs. Benson had now appeared. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Benson." "Mr. Nash," the older woman acknowledged with a knowing smile. "Successful trip, I see." "Very," Samuel confirmed. "In fact, I've brought some items for your store, coffee and sugar at Denver prices, if you're interested." Mrs. Benson's eyebrows rose with interest. "Indeed I am." Virginia, Perhaps you could help Mr. Nash unload while I check my inventory to see what we need." Before Virginia could respond, Mrs. Benson had retreated into the store, leaving them alone on the porch. "She's not very subtle," Virginia observed with a small laugh. "I'm grateful for it," Samuel admitted. "I've been thinking about seeing you again for days." The honest admission warmed Virginia. "I received your letter," she said. "It was kind of you to write. Did you send a reply? I left before the next stagecoach arrived." "I did," Virginia confirmed. "You'll probably find it waiting when you get home." Samuel smiled at that. "Something to look forward to then." He glanced at the store entrance to ensure they were still alone, then added in a lower voice, "Ginny, I was hoping you might join me for supper tonight. I have something I'd like to discuss with you." The seriousness in his tone made Virginia's heart beat faster. "At your ranch again?" "No," Samuel replied. "I thought we might go to the hotel restaurant. What I have to say, I'd like to say properly in town." Virginia felt a flutter of anticipation and nervousness. "What time?" "6 o'clock. I'll finish my deliveries and come back for you." "I'll be ready," Virginia promised. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity for Virginia. After helping Samuel unload the supplies for the store, she attended to customers with half her mind elsewhere, wondering what Samuel wanted to discuss. When Mrs. Benson noticed her distraction and learned of her dinner plans, she insisted Virginia leave early to prepare. "A woman should never rush her toilette before an important evening," the older woman declared, shooing Virginia toward the door at 4 o'clock. At home, Virginia spent an unprecedented amount of time on her appearance. She washed her hair and pinned it in a softer style than her usual severe bun, letting a few honey-colored curls frame her face. She chose her blue dress again, the one Samuel had first seen her in at church, and added a small cameo brooch at her throat that had been her mother's. As she made these preparations, Virginia found herself thinking about how different this anticipation was from the dread she had often felt when preparing for an evening with Harold. With Harold, she had worried about saying the wrong thing, wearing something he might find too plain or too showy, doing anything that might trigger his temper. With Samuel, she worried only about expressing her growing feelings appropriately. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Virginia took a deep breath, smoothing her skirts one last time before answering it. Samuel stood on her porch, freshly shaved and wearing what appeared to be a new jacket. His eyes widened appreciatively as they took in her appearance. "Ginny," he breathed, "you look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, pleased by his reaction. "You look very handsome yourself." He offered his arm, which she took, and they walked toward the hotel. The summer evening was perfect warm without being oppressive. The western sky painted in dramatic oranges and pinks as the sun set behind the mountains. The hotel restaurant was busier than it had been on their previous visits, with several tables occupied by local families and a few travelers passing through. The hostess led them to a table by the window, where the last of the sunset painted the white tablecloth with golden light. After they ordered roast chicken and vegetables, with apple pie for dessert, Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something from Denver," he said, placing it on the table between them. Virginia looked at the package in surprise. "You didn't need to bring me a gift." "I wanted to," Samuel insisted. "Please open it." Virginia carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small leather-bound book. She opened it to find a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson. "Oh, Samuel," she breathed, running her finger gently over the gilded page edges. "It's lovely." "The bookseller said she's becoming quite popular, especially among ladies," Samuel explained. "I remembered you mentioning you enjoyed poetry." Virginia was touched not just by the gift itself, but by the thought behind it, the fact that Samuel had remembered a casual comment she'd made weeks ago about enjoying poetry as a girl. Harold had never listened to her that closely, had never bothered to learn her preferences or interests. "Thank you," she said, closing the book carefully and placing it beside her plate. "I'll treasure it." Their meal arrived, temporarily halting their conversation. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Samuel set down his fork and looked at Virginia with an expression that made her heart skip. "Ginny," he began, his voice low enough not to be overheard by neighboring tables. "These past weeks of knowing you have been the happiest I've had in years." Virginia set down her own utensils, sensing the importance of what was coming. "I've felt the same," she admitted softly. Samuel nodded, a smile briefly lighting his features before his expression grew serious again. "I know it hasn't been long since Harold passed, and I understand if you feel it's too soon. But I can't deny my feelings for you any longer." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "I've fallen in love with you, Ginny, completely and irrevocably." The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying in their honesty. Virginia felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Samuel," she whispered, unable to say more past the emotion tightening her throat. "You don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "I know you might need time to consider what I'm saying, but I wanted you to know how I feel and that my intentions are serious." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "I want to court you properly, Ginny, and if in time you feel you could consider me as a husband, nothing would make me happier." Virginia looked into Samuel's earnest face, seeing the love and hope in his eyes. In that moment, all her doubts and fears seemed to fall away. Her experience with Harold had taught her to recognize cruelty and selfishness in a man. But it had also taught her to recognize their absence, to value kindness, respect, and genuine care when she found them. And she had found them, abundantly, in Samuel Nash. "I don't need time," she said, her voice stronger now as she placed her hand in his. "I love you too, Samuel." The joy that transformed his face was something Virginia knew she would remember for the rest of her life. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and steady. "You've made me the happiest man in Colorado," he said, his voice rough with emotion. They finished their meal in a kind of glowing happiness, speaking of small things but communicating volumes in their glances and smiles. When they left the restaurant, the night had fully fallen, with stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on velvet. Samuel walked Virginia home, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm. At her door, he turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked. Virginia nodded. "I'd like that." Samuel hesitated, then slowly leaned forward. Virginia's heart raced as she realized his intention. He paused, his face inches from hers, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, she closed the distance between them. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, nothing like Harold's demanding, possessive kisses. Samuel's lips were soft against hers, and his hand came up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. When he pulled away, his eyes were dark with emotion. "Good night, Ginny," he murmured. "Good night, Samuel," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As she closed the door behind her and leaned against it, Virginia felt as though her life had been divided into two distinct parts before this night and after. The future stretched before her, bright with possibility in a way she had never dared to imagine. The courtship that followed was both traditional and unconventional. Samuel called on Virginia almost daily, sometimes for only a few minutes if she was busy at the store, sometimes for hours as they sat on her porch talking. They attended church together each Sunday, followed by dinner at the hotel restaurant or a picnic by the creek on Samuel's property. Virginia discovered the pleasure of being courted by a man who genuinely respected her, who asked for her opinions and listened to her answers, who never raised his voice or made demands, who looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. September brought cooler weather and the first hints of autumn color to the cottonwoods along the creek. On a particularly beautiful Sunday afternoon, Samuel took Virginia for a drive in his wagon, following the river north of town into an aspen grove just beginning to turn golden. They spread a blanket beneath the trees and unpacked the picnic basket. Samuel had prepared cold chicken, biscuits, apples from the general store, and a bottle of sweet cider. As they ate, Virginia noticed Samuel seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous. "Is everything all right?" she asked as they finished their meal. "You seem preoccupied today." Samuel smiled, though the nervous energy remained in his movements as he repacked the empty dishes. "Just thinking," he said, "about how quickly life can change. 3 months ago, I never could have imagined sitting here with you like this." Virginia nodded, understanding his meaning. 3 months ago, I couldn't have imagined being happy again." Samuel's expression softened at her words. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, holding it between them. "Ginny," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I know it hasn't been long and some might say we're rushing, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Virginia's breath caught as Samuel opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small, perfect diamond. "I love you," he continued. "I want to spend my life with you, to make a home with you, to see you smile every morning and hold you every night. Virginia Taylor, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Virginia's eyes as she looked from the ring to Samuel's hopeful face. All her life, she had been told what to do, what to think, how to behave, first by her father, then by Harold. Never had she been offered a choice that was truly her own, a decision based solely on her own heart's desire. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain despite her tears. "Yes, Samuel, I will marry you." The joy that lit his face was matched by the happiness Virginia felt as Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, neither too tight nor too loose, as though it had been made for her. When he leaned forward to kiss her, Virginia met him halfway, her arms going around his neck in a display of affection that would have scandalized Manasseh society had anyone been there to witness it. "When?" Samuel asked when they finally parted, his forehead resting against hers. "When will you marry me?" Virginia thought about the question seriously. As a widow, she wasn't bound by the same lengthy engagement periods expected of young, unmarried women. And at 25, with 7 years of marriage already behind her, she felt no need for extended preparations. "Soon," she decided. "Before winter, I don't want to wait until spring." Samuel's smile was radiant. Next month, October, would be beautiful with the leaves changing. Virginia nodded, returning his smile. "October it is." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Manasseh. Most reactions were positive. Mrs. Benson declared she'd seen it coming from the start and immediately offered to help with wedding preparations. Reverend Palmer, after a serious conversation with both of them about the brevity of their courtship, gave his blessing and agreed to perform the ceremony in mid-October. A few tongues wagged about the propriety of a widow remarrying so soon after her husband's death, but even the town's strictest matrons had to admit that Virginia seemed transformed by her relationship with Samuel. The quiet, shadowed woman who had moved through town like a ghost during her marriage to Harold had been replaced by someone vibrant and confident, who smiled easily and spoke her mind. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with preparations. Virginia, with Mrs. Benson's help, made a new dress of soft ivory wool, simple but elegant with lace at the collar and cuffs. Samuel added a bedroom to his cabin, enlarging the space in anticipation of their life together. Virginia began packing her belongings, deciding what to bring to her new home and what to leave behind or sell with the house. 2 days before the wedding, Virginia made a final visit to Harold's grave. She had not been back since the funeral, feeling no connection to the plot of earth that contained the man who had caused her so much pain. But as she prepared to begin a new life with Samuel, she felt a need for closure with the old one. The cemetery was quiet in the October afternoon, leaves from the surrounding trees drifting down to cover the graves in a carpet of gold and russet. Harold's marker was simple, a plain stone with his name, dates of birth and death, and the word husband beneath. Virginia stood before it, feeling not grief but a complex mixture of relief, regret, and finally, release. "I didn't love you," she said softly to the stone. "Not at the end, maybe not ever, not really. But I'm sorry for what happened to us both, that you became so bitter and angry, that I became so afraid and small. I'm sorry we couldn't make each other happy." She placed the small bunch of wildflowers she had brought on the grave not out of sentiment, but as a gesture of farewell. "I'm moving forward now," she continued. "I've found someone who loves me as I am, who doesn't want to change or control me. I'm going to be happy, Harold. I hope, wherever you are, you can find some peace too." As Virginia turned to leave, she felt lighter, as though she had set down a burden she hadn't realized she was still carrying. The path ahead seemed clearer now, unobstructed by shadows from her past. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with the aspens around Manasseh at the peak of their autumn glory. The ceremony was held in the small church, which had been decorated with fall flowers and greenery by the ladies of the congregation. Only about 20 people attended, close friends from town, Samuel's ranch hands, and a few travelers who happened to be passing through and were invited to join the celebration. Virginia wore her new ivory dress, with a small crown of orange and yellow chrysanthemums in her hair instead of a veil. She carried a bouquet of the same flowers mixed with late-blooming wildflowers from Samuel's meadow. As Reverend Palmer spoke the familiar words of the marriage service, Virginia looked into Samuel's eyes and saw her future reflected there, bright, full of love, and free from fear. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "You may kiss your bride." Samuel's kiss was gentle but full of promise, his hand warm against the small of Virginia's back, when they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Nash. The applause and cheers filled the small church. The reception was held at the hotel, where a special dinner had been prepared. There was music from a fiddle player who happened to be staying in town, and dancing in the cleared space of the dining room. Virginia found herself laughing more than she had in years as Samuel swung her through a lively reel, his own joy evident in every movement. As the celebration continued into the evening, Virginia slipped away to change into her traveling clothes. She and Samuel would be spending their wedding night at his ranch, their ranch now, but had decided to take a short wedding trip to Denver the following day, staying for a week before returning to prepare for winter. When Virginia emerged from the hotel room where she had changed, she found Samuel waiting in the hallway, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her in her dark blue traveling suit. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Nash?" he asked, offering his arm. The words filled Virginia with a happiness so complete it almost hurt. "Yes, Mr. Nash," she replied, taking his arm. "I believe I am." They slipped out a side entrance to avoid the good-natured teasing that would have accompanied a formal departure. Samuel's wagon was waiting, decorated with ribbons and flowers by his ranch hands. He helped Virginia up to the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The drive to the ranch in the gathering dusk was peaceful, the cooling air fragrant with pine and sage. Virginia leaned against Samuel's shoulder, content in a way she had never expected to be. "Happy?" Samuel asked, glancing down at her. "Completely," Virginia assured him. "Are you?" "More than I can say," he replied, his arm tightening around her briefly. "I never thought I'd find someone like you, Ginny. Never thought I'd be lucky enough to make you my wife." As the ranch came into view, Virginia saw that someone, likely one of the ranch hands, had lit lamps in all the windows of the cabin. The golden light spilled out onto the porch and yard, creating a welcoming glow in the deepening twilight. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Welcome home," Samuel said softly, bringing the wagon to a stop. Before Virginia could climb down, Samuel had set the brake and moved around to her side. To her surprise, he reached up and lifted her bodily from the seat, swinging her into his arms. "Samuel," she laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my bride across the threshold," he replied with a grin. "It's tradition." He carried her up the porch steps and across the threshold of the cabin, setting her gently on her feet in the main room. Virginia looked around, taking in the changes Samuel had made in preparation for her arrival. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt draped the back of the armchair, and a vase of autumn flowers stood on the table. "You like it?" Samuel asked, watching her face anxiously. "I had Mrs. Benson help with some of the touches. Said I didn't know what a woman would want." Virginia turned to him, her heart so full she could hardly speak. "It's perfect," she managed finally. "All of it is perfect." Samuel's anxious expression melted into relief, then something deeper as he stepped closer to her. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle and reverent. "I love you, Ginny Nash," he whispered. "And I love you," she replied, rising on her toes to meet his kiss. Later, as they lay in the new, wider bed Samuel had built, Virginia rested her head on her husband's chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, answered by another farther away. The sound was wild and free, much like the life she had found with Samuel. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, his voice rumbling beneath her ear as his hand stroked her unbound hair. Virginia smiled in the darkness. "I'm thinking that 6 months ago I never would have believed this possible, that I could be so happy, so at peace." Samuel's arms tightened around her. "When I saw you at Harold's funeral," he admitted, "I almost didn't approach you. It seemed wrong somehow to see the relief on your face and feel hopeful because of it." Virginia propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at her husband's face in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I'm glad you did approach me," she said softly. "You saw what no one else was willing to see, that I needed rescuing, not from widowhood, but from the memory of a marriage that had become a prison." Samuel reached up to touch her cheek. "You rescued yourself, Ginny. I just offered a destination." Virginia leaned down to kiss him, overwhelmed by the understanding and respect in his words. "Then I'm glad you offered," she whispered against his lips, "and I'm glad I had the courage to accept." As she settled back against his chest, Virginia thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the fearful, diminished woman she had been with Harold to the confident, loved woman she was becoming with Samuel. The future stretched before them, full of possibility: children perhaps, the growth of the ranch, years of building a life together based on mutual respect and genuine love. Outside their window, the stars shone over the Colorado wilderness, bright and clear in the autumn sky. Virginia Nash closed her eyes, safe in her husband's arms, finally home. 5 years later, on a bright spring morning, Virginia Nash stood on the porch of what was now known throughout the region as the Nash Ranch. At 30, she had grown into her confidence and strength, no longer the fearful woman who had stood dry-eyed at Harold Taylor's funeral. Her honey-colored hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her capable hands rested on the porch railing as she surveyed the property that had flourished under her and Samuel's care. The small log cabin had been expanded into a proper ranch house, with additional bedrooms, a larger kitchen, and a dedicated sitting room filled with books. The herd had grown to over 50 head of cattle, and the garden now included not just vegetables but flowering plants that Virginia had cultivated with care. The young fruit trees Samuel had planted years earlier were beginning to bear, promising a good harvest of apples and pears in the fall. From inside the house came the sound of childish laughter, followed by Samuel's deeper chuckle. Virginia smiled, turning as the front door opened and her husband emerged, their 3-year-old son Thomas riding on his shoulders and their infant daughter Eliza cradled in his arm. "Mama," Thomas called excitedly. "Papa's taking me to see the new foal." Virginia's smile widened as she reached up to ruffle her son's dark curls, so like his father's. "Is he now? And who's going to help me with the bread dough I just set to rise?" "I'll be back in time," Samuel promised, leaning forward carefully to kiss her cheek. "Eliza and I will just tag along to make sure this young cowboy doesn't get into mischief." Virginia took her daughter from Samuel's arms, pressing a kiss to the infant's soft forehead. At 6 months, Eliza was a calm, observant baby with her mother's blue eyes and fair coloring. "The bread can wait," she decided. "I'll come with you to see the foal." Together, the family walked toward the barn, Thomas chattering excitedly from his perch on Samuel's shoulders. As they entered the cool dimness of the stable, the newly born foal and its mother looked up from a bed of fresh straw. The foal, all spindly legs and curious eyes, attempted to stand at their approach. "She's trying to get up, Papa," Thomas whispered in awe. "Yes, she is," Samuel confirmed, setting his son carefully on the ground but keeping a firm hand on his shoulder to prevent him from rushing forward. "She's still learning how to use those long legs." Virginia watched as her husband gently guided their son, teaching him to approach the animals slowly and speak quietly so as not to frighten them. Samuel's patience with the children never failed to touch her heart, reminding her daily of how fortunate she was to have found him. The foal managed to stand, wobbling slightly before taking a few tentative steps toward them, its mother watching carefully. Thomas's face glowed with delight at the animal's approach. "She likes me," he breathed as the foal sniffed curiously at his outstretched hand. "She does," Samuel agreed, pride evident in his voice as he observed his son's gentle handling of the animal. "You're going to be a fine horseman, Thomas." After spending some time with the new foal, they returned to the house, where Virginia settled Eliza in her cradle before returning to her bread-making. Samuel took Thomas out to help collect eggs from the chicken coop, a task the little boy considered a great responsibility. The domestic rhythm of their day continued as it always did, filled with work, but also with moments of connection and joy. That evening, after the children were asleep, Virginia and Samuel sat on the porch in the same 2 rocking chairs that had been there when she first visited. The spring air was cool but pleasant, fragrant with the scent of the lilacs Virginia had planted along the front of the house. "I had a letter from Mrs. Benson today," Virginia mentioned, her chair rocking gently. "She says the new owner of the general store is doing well, but everyone still misses us in town." Samuel nodded, reaching over to take her hand. "Do you ever miss it? Living in town, working at the store?" Virginia considered the question honestly, as she did all questions between them. Sometimes I miss the regular interaction with people, she admitted. But I love our life here. I love that we've built something together that the children have space to run and grow. She squeezed his hand. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Samuel brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles in an echo of that first kiss years ago on her porch in Manasseh. "Nor would I," he said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Finally, Virginia said, "I've been thinking about Harold lately." Samuel turned to look at her, no jealousy or concern in his expression, only attentive interest. "Oh, what about him? Just that I barely remember his face now," Virginia admitted. "Isn't that strange? I was married to him for 7 years, lived in fear of him for most of that time, and now I can hardly recall what he looked like." Samuel considered this thoughtfully. "Maybe it's a mercy," he suggested, "that the mind lets go of what it doesn't need to carry anymore." Virginia nodded, appreciating as always her husband's insight. "I think you're right. I remember how he made me feel small and afraid and worthless, but that memory is distant now, like something that happened to someone else." "You've come a long way from that frightened woman I saw at the funeral," Samuel observed, his voice warm with pride and love. "We both have," Virginia replied, thinking of the solitary cowboy who had offered her a chance at happiness when she least expected it. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken to me that day." Samuel's expression grew serious. "I almost didn't," he confessed. "I'd noticed you before at church in town, and I'd heard things about Harold, saw the bruises you tried to hide, but approaching a new widow. It wasn't the proper thing to do." "What changed your mind?" Virginia asked, curious about this detail he'd never shared. "Your face," Samuel said simply. "When they lowered his coffin into the ground, you looked free. Like someone who'd been underwater for a long time and finally reached the surface. I knew then that you weren't grieving, that you might be ready for something better than what you'd had." Virginia felt tears prick her eyes at the memory and at her husband's perception. "You were right," she whispered. "I was ready. I just didn't know it until you offered me another possibility." Samuel leaned over to kiss her gently, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her lips. "Offering that possibility to the most remarkable woman I've ever known." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, their hands intertwined, Virginia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the silence of a graveyard where no tears were shed, to the warmth of a home filled with love and laughter. From a marriage of fear and control to one of partnership and respect. From merely surviving to truly living. Nobody had mourned when Harold Taylor died. But from that ending had come the most beautiful beginning Virginia could have imagined: a life with Samuel Nash, who had seen her relief that day and offered her something far better instead. A future filled with love, respect, and the kind of happiness she had once thought existed only in dreams.